Eli Grant spotted it the moment he turned onto his driveway, crisp white envelope, folded over the top slat of his wooden gate. The wind hadn't taken it, which meant it had been placed with care, not taped, not tucked under the mat. Just sitting there, like a calling card. He stepped out of his car, grabbed the envelope, and flipped it over. No name, just a typed label on the front, regarding backyard structure. He sighed softly and opened it right there. Standing between his truck and the quiet hum of the sprinkler across the street, inside was a short, neatly worded letter, 2 paragraphs, double-spaced, signed at the bottom in blue ink. Nancy Whitmore, HOA president. The letter was polite enough. It mentioned concerns about his backyard fence and how it appeared to be above the typical height observed throughout the neighborhood. There was no demand. It's just a gentle request to address the matter or connect with the board if clarification was needed. Still, the intent was clear. Eli read it once more, then folded the letter and slid it into his back pocket. The irony wasn't lost on him. Nancy had always struck him as someone who operated with purpose, even if that purpose felt more personal than official. She ran the monthly meetings like a tiny town hall, with color-coded binders and an extra chair at the front for dramatic effect. Eli had seen her pacing her lawn with a measuring wheel once, and another time, she was peering over someone's flower bed with a tiny notebook in hand. He couldn't really blame her. Some people took pride in control. It gave them a sense of order, a sense of place. What she didn't know, what most people didn't know, was that Eli's quiet personality wasn't from a lack of experience. He wasn't new to structure. In fact, structure was literally his job. He wasn't a handyman or a contractor. He was a city inspector, more specifically. A senior zoning and compliance officer who had walked through more yards, peered at more foundation lines, and checked more fence permits than he could count. He built that fence himself, measured it 3 times, dug the posts to exact depth, even submitted the specs and photos to the city's own portal before he began construction. Not just because he had to, but because he enjoyed doing things right. He always had, so no, his fence wasn't too high. It was exactly what the city allowed. What Nancy didn't seem to realize was that the local board's preferences weren't law. They were suggestions, guidelines at best. And Eli had no interest in playing into suggestions that leaned more on tone than truth. Still, he wasn't upset. Amused? Maybe. There was something almost charming about it, like a neighborhood mystery where the wrong suspect got picked. I walked into his backyard and looked up at the fence. Clay lines. Solid wood. Stained last month with a weather-resistant finish. He had taken care with it. Made sure it was good for privacy, but not towering. The kind of thing a neighbor could lean on while chatting over a barbecue, but not something that made the yard feel like a fortress. He stood there for a moment longer, watching a squirrel dart across the top rail and disappear into the tree line. Then he walked inside, dropped the envelope on the kitchen counter, and opened the fridge for something cold. This wasn't a big deal, but it was going to get interesting. Because Eli wasn't the type to make a scene, but he also wasn't the type to let a small misunderstanding carry on too long. Especially not when the person pointing fingers didn't know exactly who she was pointing them at. Eli Grant wasn't the kind of person most people remembered after a neighborhood barbecue. He was polite, asked thoughtful questions, and rarely stayed long enough for small talk to become gossip. At first glance, he came across as the quiet type, slightly reserved. Maybe a little too comfortable with silence, but silence doesn't always mean nothing is happening. Behind that calm exterior was a man who'd spent the last 15 years walking construction sites, reviewing permit applications, and watching people try to cut corners with a smile. Some were harmless mistakes. Others were intentional, dressed up to look accidental. Either way, Eli had seen it all. He didn't judge. He just did his job. When he and his wife moved to Maplewood Trails, they were looking for peace. Something slower. Their daughter had just started college across the state, and after years of living closer to the city center, they craved space. More trees, less traffic. Somewhere they could spend long evenings on a patio with a drink and not hear sirens in the distance. They found the place almost by accident. A modest two-story on a corner lot with a backyard that backed up to an empty wooded buffer zone. It was quiet, and Eli liked quiet. The house didn't need much work, just a few updates. And the fence, of course. He designed the fence before they even moved in. Tall enough for privacy, low enough to stay friendly. Nothing too flashy. Just something that matched the house, blended with the trees, and followed every single local guideline. He pulled the records himself, cross-checked them with city archives, and even called to confirm one of the measurement rules just to be thorough. So when Nancy's note appeared, with its gently sharp tone, Eli wasn't irritated, but he was curious. He remembered seeing Nancy for the first time at the neighborhood's fall welcome mixer. She wore a deep red sweater and moved through the crowd with a clipboard and a wide, polished smile. She made a point to introduce herself to everyone twice if she thought they'd forgotten her name. Nancy wasn't unkind, but she carried herself like someone who had written the neighborhood's rules by hand. And maybe, in a way, she had. She seemed to know exactly how long someone's trash bins had been on the curb, how many lawn decorations counted as tasteful, and when a porch light should be dimmed for community ambiance. She never once asked what Eli did for a living. Most people assumed he worked in engineering or logistics, something involving spreadsheets and safety vests. When he did tell people he worked for the city, they usually assumed he meant the DMV or a planning office. Eli never felt the need to correct them, but the truth was more specific and far more relevant to Nancy's note. He was a zoning and planning inspector, licensed to approve or deny construction at both residential and commercial levels. He reviewed site plans, cross-checked materials, verified safety standards, and ensured that what people built matched what they claimed. It was a job built on precision, and people who ignored precision didn't usually enjoy his visits. Not that he ever raised his voice. He didn't need to. Eli's strength was in knowing where the line was drawn on when someone stepped over it. With too much confidence, he glanced out his kitchen window now, watching the sun dip lower behind the line of trees. The fence cast a long shadow across the yard. Solid, clean, legal. There was no urgency, no need to rush. But eventually, Nancy would realize who he was, and more importantly, what he knew. And when she did, this little letter about a fence might become something much bigger than either of them expected. It started with a walk. Not one of those walks with a purpose, no clipboard, no phone, not even headphones. It's just a cup of black coffee in a ceramic mug and a slow pace through the quiet streets of twitchy Maplewood Trails. Eli always liked early morning walks, especially on Sundays. The neighborhood still felt half asleep. Sprinklers buzzed lazily across trimmed lawns. A dog barked in the distance. Birds stirred in the trees overhead. No cars passed. No one waved. It was the kind of stillness that let him think clearly. He didn't go out with any plan in mind. He wasn't snooping. He didn't even bring a pen. But when you've spent years noticing details most people ignore, it's hard to turn that part of your brain off. And as he walked past tidy driveways and neatly arranged flower beds, little things began to stand out. A small shed, placed just a little too close to the neighbor's property line. A pergola built into a slope using a mix of old and new lumber, possibly added after the main permit was approved. A deck with no railing on one side, which wouldn't pass inspection in any city district he'd ever worked in. He didn't stop. He didn't write anything down. But the mental snapshots formed instantly, stored without effort. He turned the corner onto Dogwood Court. Passing the row of townhomes on the southern edge of the neighborhood, a bright blue door caught his eye not because of the color, but because it was framed by two large stone planters bolted into the sidewalk. Technically, the sidewalk was public easement space, which meant bolting anything to it was a no-go. Eli took another sip of coffee and kept walking. By the time he looped back toward his street, the sun had climbed higher and the quiet had started to lift. A few garage doors were open now. A couple kids rode scooters past him. Someone was pulling weeds by their mailbox. He passed Nancy's house last. It was impossible to miss. Her front garden was pristine, symmetrical, and organized with almost unsettling precision, like a landscape design, straight out of a home magazine. The hedges were clipped into geometric shapes, and the small pond at the center sparkled like it had just been cleaned. But the wall caught his eye at the back corner of her property. Partially covered by rose bushes sat a decorative stone privacy wall taller than a person, tucked neatly behind the shed. And extending farther than most would notice unless they walked the full loop around the house. It blended in well, but Eli's trained eye spotted it instantly. That kind of wall was fine in most cases. But in this area, anything over 6 feet, decorative or not, was supposed to be listed with the city when installed. Not as a punishment, just for record keeping. It helped with emergency access planning, flood management, and long-term neighborhood mapping. He remembered checking the permits for this neighborhood when they moved in. Nancy's name had appeared more than once, mostly for cosmetic improvements, paint colors, landscaping, even mailbox posts. But nothing had ever been filed for a structure like this wall. He smiled to himself, not with smugness, but with curiosity. He wasn't going to do anything about it. Not yet. But it was interesting. The letter on his gate hadn't been personal. He understood that. But sometimes people forgot that rules went in more than one direction. And sometimes the people enforcing them weren't always as informed as they thought they were. Eli turned into his driveway, finished the last sip of his coffee, and stood in front of his fence for a moment. Still there, still strong, still within limits. This was going to unfold naturally. He wouldn't need to raise a finger. All he had to do was wait. The community clubhouse was built to look friendly, white walls, big windows, a row of rocking chairs out front. But once a month, it took on a different atmosphere. Folding chairs replaced casual conversation. The welcome table became a battlefield of printed agendas and lukewarm coffee. And at the center of it all was Nancy, seated behind a long plastic table, her clipboard perfectly squared to the edge. Eli arrived too. Minutes early, he nodded at a few familiar faces, neighbors he'd waved to, but never really spoken with. Most of them gave polite smiles in return. A few glanced at him a little longer, as if trying to place him. New guy. Corner lot fence, he took a seat near the back. Out of the center, but still within earshot, the meeting began with the usual items: budget, updates, a shout-out for the block party volunteers, and a brief complaint about someone's Halloween decorations being too realistic. Nancy moved through the list quickly, her voice clear and practiced. She had a way of making even the smallest notes sound official, as if every word was being recorded. Then she cleared her throat. "There's one additional item I'd like to bring up," she said, her tone shifting just slightly. It was brought to my attention that a new fence was recently installed on Cedar Ridge corner lot, backing up to the preserve. Everyone knew which house she meant. Eli didn't blink. Nancy continued. "While the fence is tasteful and certainly well maintained, it may exceed the suggested height guidelines outlined in our handbook. I left a courtesy note just as a reminder, and I'd like to discuss how we might ensure all future projects are reviewed before being built." There it was. Not an accusation, just a carefully worded conversation starter. It was classic. Nancy, gentle on the surface, but designed to nudge. Eli raised his hand. Nancy's smile twitched. "Yes, Mr. Grant." He stood, calm and measured. "Thanks for the note," he said, his voice even. "Just wanted to clarify a couple things since my fence was mentioned. I actually followed all local requirements, including the most recent city standards. I submitted plans, waited for the review, and built within the approved guidelines." Nancy's fingers tightened slightly on her pen. "Yes, well, our handbook provides additional preferences that help maintain the character of the neighborhood. Not all city regulations consider that." Eli nodded slowly. "That's true in some areas. But Maplewood Trails was developed under a master permit agreement. The HOA guidelines are non-binding suggestions. Anything structurally compliant with the city takes precedence." A silence followed, not awkward, just ... different. A couple board members looked up from their papers. One of them leaned over to whisper to the woman beside him. Nancy's smile thinned. "And what experience do you have with city code, Mr. Grant?" Eli looked directly at her, not with smugness, just clarity. "I'm a municipal inspector. Zoning, planning, and development review. I sign off on structural permits for a living." It landed like a quiet THUNDERCLAP. Nancy blinked once. "I see." Eli sat back down, no gloating, no grin, just calm, professional quiet. He didn't need to say more. The facts had done the work for him. The rest of the meeting moved quickly. There was a noticeable shift in energy, less controlled, more cautious. Questions were asked, notes were taken. And when Nancy wrapped up the agenda, she skipped over the fence item entirely as people stood to leave. A few glanced Eli's way, not with judgment, but curiosity. A couple nodded, just slightly. Outside, the air was cooler than it had been all week. Eli walked home slowly, hands in his pockets. He hadn't embarrassed anyone. He hadn't even corrected Nancy harshly. But sometimes, truth changes the room. And now, the room had changed. 2 days after the meeting, city vehicle rolled slowly through Maplewood Trails. It wasn't loud or flashy, just a silver sedan with the familiar municipal seal printed discreetly on the driver's side door. No lights, no clipboard-waving officers. Just a quiet drive-through by someone doing what Eli had always called a visibility pass. The driver was a colleague of his. Her name was Marcy. She wasn't there for any enforcement or response. She was just doing a routine community observation. For district records, Maplewood Trails, like every neighborhood in the city's growing west side, was due for a general update to its infrastructure mapping. That meant a few drive-bys, some perimeter checks, and a gentle look at how neighborhoods had evolved since their last review. It was entirely normal, but Nancy didn't see it that. Eli watched from his front porch as the silver car paused briefly at the stop sign near her house. Nancy stood in her driveway with a gardening spade in hand, frozen mid-movement, eyes locked on the city seal. The car stayed for no more than 10 seconds, then turned down the next street. From across the yard, Eli could feel her stare shift. He gave a polite nod and raised his coffee mug. She didn't wave back by the end of the week. The shift had become more obvious, not just in Nancy's posture, but in how people around the neighborhood behaved. Neighbors started asking questions. At first, they were casual. "Hey Eli, you know if there's a reason the city's been driving through here?" Or, "I saw someone checking a utility box. Are we getting new lines?" Harmless curiosity. But Eli could tell there was something more behind it, a quiet realization that maybe their corner of the world wasn't as sealed off as they'd believed. He never mentioned the fence, never brought up Nancy. He just explained the process simply, the way he would to any one city planning updates, public record maintenance. Small compliance adjustments that happen every year whether people notice or not. But even that small, Transparency started to shift the balance. One evening, Eli stopped by the community clubhouse to drop off some paperwork for an unrelated city project. As he stepped inside, he heard two board members in quiet conversation, low voices, but not low enough. "I just think we should double-check before we send those notes out next time." "I agree. It's not a bad thing to ask, but we don't want to step into something that isn't ours to manage." They stopped talking when they saw him. He smiled. "Evening?" One of them, a tall man named Brian, gave a slightly sheepish wave. "Hey Eli, thanks again for the clarification at the meeting. It helped, honestly." Eli nodded. "Anytime." It wasn't a takeover. He didn't want that. But he could feel the balance tipping slowly, quietly. Like a table leg settling evenly after wobbling for too long. People weren't turning against Nancy. They were just realizing that maybe there was more to the rules than the binder she kept under her arm. Maybe things didn't need to be so rigid. Maybe the guy with the quiet smile and steady voice actually knew what he was doing. As Eli walked back home that night, he passed by 3 houses he'd once only nodded toward. Now each one had an owner out front watering plants, chatting in the driveway, pausing just long enough to wave. He waved back. The fence still stood tall behind his house. Same height, same wood, same stain. Nothing had changed about it, except now everyone was starting to understand why it was never the problem. Nancy didn't stop tending her garden. If anything, she doubled down. Her hydrangeas were pruned to perfection. The stone borders realigned, and the welcome sign by her door had been freshly painted in a new shade of blue. Everything in her world looked orderly, but something had changed. And she could feel it. It was in the way people started skipping her emails, the polite reminders she sent out each week with subject lines like gentle notice and a quick heads up. Where once she'd get replies within the hour, now they came slower. If at all, the Halloween decor debate fizzled out entirely. No one weighed in when she asked for volunteers to help with seasonal porch standardization. And at the last board meeting, when she brought up mailbox uniformity again, 2 members quietly redirected the discussion before she could finish her sentence. Meanwhile, Eli stayed quiet, friendly, always waving, always saying good morning. He wasn't orchestrating anything. That's what made it all so effective. The neighbors were starting to lean on him, not just for fence specs or city rules, but for the kinds of things that Nancy used to be the gatekeeper for. One afternoon, the elderly couple from 2 streets overstopped Eli while he was trimming the hedges. They'd recently received a suggestion from Nancy about reconsidering their solar lights, and they weren't sure what counted as too bright. Eli offered to come by, took a quick look, and told them plainly that everything was fine. The city had no issues with lights below a certain wattage, and theirs were well under. They thanked him 3 times before he'd even stepped off their lawn. Word started to spread, not through gossip, but through casual conversation. Eli didn't brag, didn't take sides. He just answered questions, clearly, confidently, kindly, and people listened at one point. Nancy tried to reassert her role in a community email labeled Important Spring Guidelines Reminder. It was 4 paragraphs long and included bullet points about acceptable potted plant sizes, wind chime tones, and a reminder about the emotional weight of overly personal lawn signs. But this time, someone replied, residents included. It was Brian, the soft-spoken board member with a young family. His message was brief, polite, and impossible to ignore. "Hi Nancy, appreciate the time you put into this, but I'd suggest we hold off on enforcing preferences that go beyond what the city allows. It might be worth revisiting the handbook." With input from more homeowners this year, a few others chimed in, all with the same tone, respectful but firm. Nancy didn't reply. She didn't need to hear their words. She already knew what was happening. Her position hadn't been removed, had simply been bypassed. Not maliciously, just naturally. Like a stream shifting around a rock, that weekend the neighborhood held its spring potluck. It had been Brian's idea this time, not Nancy's, and it was hosted in the cul-de-sac near the park. No sign-up sheet, no seating chart, just a few folding tables, coolers full of lemonade, and a lot of lawn chairs. Eli and his wife brought fresh baked rolls and sat near the edge under a shady tree. People came up. They asked about trees, property lines, and zoning for patio covers. Eli answered each question with calm clarity, never pushing, never correcting. Just helping. At one point, Nancy arrived. She was dressed nicely, carrying a tray of cookies and a neutral expression. She mingled a bit, then quietly found a seat near the food table. Eli noticed but didn't approach her. He didn't need to, because the message had already landed. Rules were only as strong as the trust behind them. And now, the trust had found a new home. Nancy wasn't one to give up. She had spent years shaping Maplewood Trails into the picture-perfect place she believed it should be. Neatly trimmed edges, polite parking habits, color-coordinated mailboxes. It wasn't just pride, 'twas a sense of order, a structure she could rely on, so when her influence began to slip, she didn't lash out. That wasn't her style. Instead, she wrote a letter. Not an email, not a notice, and definitely not a community-wide message. Just one letter. Folded carefully, sealed in a pale green envelope, and slipped into Eli's mailbox one breezy Thursday morning. He found it while walking the dog. No return address, but he knew the handwriting instantly. He waited until he was back inside with a fresh cup of coffee before opening it. Dear Mr. Grant, I appreciate your service and the knowledge you bring to the neighborhood. However, I must point out that knowledge and stewardship are not always the same. There is value in consistency, in community vision, and in maintaining shared standards. I hope you'll consider this before encouraging others to blur the lines between legal compliance and communal expectation. Warmly, Nancy. No threats, no accusations, just that perfectly balanced tone, part compliment, part caution. Eli read it twice, then set it on the table. He wasn't surprised. In fact, he respected the move in a way. It was vintage Nancy, direct without being aggressive, firm without being cruel. But what she didn't understand, what she'd never quite grasped, was that community didn't come from control. It came from trust. That afternoon, Eli walked the perimeter of his fence. Not because anything was wrong, just to double-check. He measured the panels, rechecked the base clearance, and even photographed the corner posts. Everything was exactly as it should be. Then, calmly, he drafted a brief note of his own. Hi Nancy, thank you for your letter. I appreciate your perspective. Just to be clear, I haven't encouraged anyone to ignore guidelines. Simply answered questions based on municipal codes and permitting laws. If there's ever a genuine concern about structural compliance, I'm always happy to review it formally and professionally. Respectfully, Eli. He printed it, folded it, and walked it over to her door. He didn't knock. He just left it tucked inside her mailbox, the same quiet way she had done later that week. Something curious happened. To homeowners people Eli hadn't even spoken with yet stopped by his house. One wanted advice on building a small greenhouse in their yard. The other had a question about driveway extensions and whether decorative pavers required permits. Both had previously leaned heavily on HOA approval. Now, they wanted to make sure their plans aligned with city standards too. Eli didn't sway them. He simply walked through the real requirements and offered to point them toward the city's project assistance line. He reminded them that the HOA could still offer suggestions, especially aesthetic ones, but that the city ultimately had final say on structures and boundaries. They nodded, asked smart questions, and left more confident than when they arrived. No drama. No sides taken, just information, by the weekend. Word had spread again, not because Eli said anything, but because people noticed something different when they asked him questions. They got answers that made sense, facts instead of fear, guidelines instead of guesses. Nancy didn't respond to his letter. Not with a note, not with a wave, but she trimmed her privacy wall bushes back further than she ever had before. And when the city's mapping vehicle returned the following month, her decorative wall was no longer obstructed. It was subtle, quiet. Just like her note, and just like Eli, she didn't make a big deal out of it. But in the calm, clipped silence of that act, something had shifted. She was starting to listen. 2. Spring was well underway, and the neighborhood had settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and new. Eli stood at the corner of his yard, adjusting the small garden flag that fluttered gently in the morning breeze. It was simpler, neutral design, nothing flashy, but it felt right. Like a quiet nod to the neighborhood's character and the life they all shared. He glanced across the street at Nancy's house. The bushes were neatly trimmed, the stone wall visible once more, standing tall but unobtrusive. The fresh paint on her mailbox caught the sunlight, and for the first time in weeks, she waved as she pulled her car out of the driveway. Eli waved back. Over the past months, things had shifted, not with loud declarations or sweeping changes, but with small moments of understanding. The HOA meetings were different now. Nancy still led, of course. Her voice was steady, but there was a softness beneath it. She welcomed questions without defensiveness. When someone brought up a concern, she listened. When people offered input, she considered it. Eli attended when he could, not to challenge, but to support, to lend a steady voice when the conversation needed it. He never tried to take over. He simply offered clarity when the room grew uncertain. The neighbors responded. They felt safer asking questions. They trusted that their concerns wouldn't be met with judgment, but with answers. And Nancy? She learned something important. Order wasn't about control. It was about care. She saw it when the elderly couple hosted a small garden tour, inviting neighbors to share tips and stories. She noticed it when families organized blocked picnics without waiting for formal permission, trusting each other to keep things welcoming and respectful. She even admitted, quietly, that maybe some guidelines were too rigid, that sometimes the spirit of the neighborhood mattered more than the letter. Eli's fence stood proudly at the corner of Cedar Ridge, exactly as it always had. But now it was more than just a boundary line. It was a symbol of balance between rules and relationships, between city codes and neighborly trust. One afternoon, Eli and Nancy crossed paths near the community garden. She smiled genuinely and held out a freshly picked bouquet of lavender. "For your porch," she said. Eli accepted it with a nod. "Thank you, Nancy. It smells great." She chuckled softly. "You know, I think we make a pretty good team." He smiled back. "I think so too." As the sun dipped lower behind the trees, the neighborhood settled into its evening calm. The fences stood tall but welcoming. The gardens flourished with care. And the quiet, steady pulse of a community learning to listen and to lead with kindness beat strong.